The Artemis 2 astronauts are not the only ones who are glad to be back home. Last month, 4 astronauts landed in the Pacific Ocean after 10 days in space. Their mission was to orbit the moon and to test out systems for further missions that will eventually put people back on the otherwise uninhabited lunar surface. It's uninhabited, at least, unless you believe Joseph Smith, in which case it is far from uninhabited. Joseph Smith seemed to believe that the moon was inhabited. Not only that, he went so far as to describe the inhabitants of the moon as follows. Inhabitants of the moon are more of a uniform size than the inhabitants of the Earth, being about 6 feet in height. They dress very much like the Quaker style and are quite general in style or the one fashion of dress. They live to be very old, coming generally near 1,000 years. Now I will say that this statement by Joseph comes from a single late account nearly 40 years on. But that account also mentions that Joseph Smith's ability as a seer is in no more doubt than the fact that he was killed by the mob. So at the very least, it was a sincerely written account. All that is to say, Joseph Smith may or may not have believed that people dressed like Quakers lived on the moon. But it is at least a fun lead-in for a prophet who definitely spoke about the moon. In a state conference in Honolulu in 1961, Joseph Fielding Smith said this: "We will never get a man into space. This Earth is man's sphere, and it was never intended that he should get away from it. The moon is a superior planet to the Earth, and it was never intended that man should go there. You can write it down in your books that this will never happen." Sounds like a prophecy, right? A man who members of the church believed to be a prophet, seer and revelator told them something would never happen and that they could write it down. But here's the awkward thing. That did in fact end up happening. Man did go to the moon. We will get to how that failed prophecy was dealt with in the next part. But first, I want to point to something that's not very often discussed when this prophecy is brought up. This wasn't the only time that Joseph Fielding Smith discussed this idea. Let's read this from church apologist institution FAIR. Joseph Fielding Smith wrote that it is doubtful that man will ever be permitted to make any instrument or ship to travel through space and visit the moon or any distant planet. According to Smith's grandson, Joseph Fielding McConkie, who actually heard him express this idea, he reasoned that because the atonement that Christ worked out on this earth applies to all creations of the Father, that our getting to other worlds and discovering that they had the same Saviour and the same plan of salvation would dispense with the necessity of our accepting the gospel on the basis of faith. Therefore, Joseph Fielding Smith assumed that we were not meant to reach other worlds since Christ's atonement applied to all worlds, and discovering this upon reaching other worlds would eliminate the need for us to accept the gospel on the basis of faith. Who on the other worlds does the atonement apply to? The inhabitants of the moon? It could be reasoned that not only did Joseph Fielding Smith believe in extraterrestrial life, but he also believed in the idea that's often attributed to his great-uncle, Joseph Smith, that there were Quakers living on the moon. Just something to think about. And also that the atonement applies to them. Now, once man had successfully gone to the moon, less than a decade after Joseph Fielding Smith made that statement, he was asked about it. And he said, "Well, I was wrong, wasn't I?" And so Joseph Fielding Smith admits he was wrong, in a statement that is now characterised by defenders of the faith as not a prophecy. Instead, they try and say that it was merely his opinion. But here's the catch. Joseph Fielding Smith didn't caveat his statement at the time with, "That's just my opinion, I'm not speaking in any prophetic manner." I'm willing to bet that if man had never successfully reached the moon, then those same apologists would now be counting his declaration as a hit. They would be saying things like, "When the whole nation thought we would get to the moon, Joseph Fielding Smith, as a prophet of the Lord, knew better." And this lands us square in the middle of the problem of when these men who are called and sustained as prophets, seers and revelators by the membership of the church, when are they ever actually acting as prophets? How can we tell? Surely the default position is if they are speaking publicly, then they are speaking prophetically, with the spirit of revelation, unless they make caveats to the contrary. So how is it then that they can make a statement without any caveats and then years later just say, "Well, I was wrong"? And apologists will rush in to try and say that it was never a prophecy, it was never prophetic, it was never filled with the spirit of revelation, he was just opining. Why are prophets out there opining in their public position as prophets, seers and revelators without letting people know that that's what they're doing? Are apologists so desperate to maintain the illusion for the emperor that even when the emperor goes, "Yeah, no, I'm not wearing any clothes at the moment," they rush in and say, "Well, hold on people, you shouldn't have expected the emperor to be clothed all the time"? In fact, silly you for thinking that the emperor was claiming to be clothed at all. Isn't that just expedience, claiming that, oh, he was never trying to be a prophet when what he said doesn't turn out to actually be prophetic? Doesn't that seem awfully convenient? In fact, is it not perchance antithetical to the spirit of prophecy to make one, and then when it turns out not to be true, try and claim it was never a prophecy in the first place? Are prophecies not things that people have to stand by in order for them to actually be prophecies? Just let me know in the comments, and while you're there, please consider supporting this work through Donor Box. $5, $10, $20 a month, or whatever you can afford will help keep this work going. Thank you so much to everyone who supports me, and I will see you in this next video here. Honestly, if you're a prophet, just stand by it. Just say, yep, that was prophecy.